Yeah, my name is Rachel, and I am the Senior Manager of Site Operations at Clara Health. We're a company that's working to help people get connected to clinical trials and support patients, sites, all those sorts of things throughout their clinical trial journey. Prior to coming to Clara Health, I worked at Oregon Health and Science University as a clinical research coordinator. So I worked directly coordinating trials in cancer as well as in anesthesiology and a couple other departments there. So I'm really passionate about clinical research, really love the field, and excited to talk to you. So broadly, clinical trials are research studies performed in people evaluating something, whether that be a drug, a surgical intervention, a behavioral intervention, or some other things that aren't necessarily interventional as well. But clinical research and clinical trials are really the primary way that researchers find out if a new treatment is safe and effective. And so these are important because they allow us to look for new treatments, new detection methods, prevention methods for various different indications, including cancer. They can take place in doctors' offices, medical centers, community hospitals, clinics, kind of lots of different places. As clinical trials are important because before treatment can be approved for everyday use and made accessible to patients, the FDA requires that a potential therapy's safety and efficacy is evaluated in clinical trials. And, like I said kind of before, they don't just study new drugs. They can also study interventions in other ways and also can study treatments that are already given to patients. But they're important because they allow us to test the safety and efficacy of new treatments and bring those to the market for the broad use and, for lots of patients. So there's two main ones. There's an observational trial, and I think that's the type that some people don't really know about because it's not necessarily what you think of when you think of a clinical trial. So an observational trial means that basically a patient isn't taking anything different than what they might be taking for whatever indication that they have. And essentially this allows researchers to follow a patient's health to learn more about a condition. And generally in observational trials, patients continue their current treatment. The other type of trial is an interventional trial. And this is the one that I think people think of more when they think of clinical research. And this is generally when a patient is accessing a treatment, whether it be a drug, a surgical intervention, or something like that, that's not yet available through the standard of care. And so these can test new treatments, so new drugs entirely, or new drugs or surgical interventions or, other types of interventions. Or they can also test new ways of existing treatments. So if there's an existing drug that's on the market, but it hasn't been used in a certain indication, a clinical trial could test this drug in a different indication. So in cancer, it could test, if something's approved for a certain type of cancer, there could be a clinical trial that's testing it in another type of cancer, for example. So it's a long process. So clinical trials are the last step in a 10 to 15-year research process to develop a new treatment for a condition. So I think sometimes people think like, oh, clinical trial, it means that you're a guinea pig and that you're just being tested on. I think that's something that we hear a lot. But something can't be approved for a clinical trial until it goes through a fairly rigorous research process prior to being tested in humans. So often with a drug, for example, the treatment has to be discovered, of course. It then needs to be successfully tested in lab cell studies. And as somebody who used to work in a lab on cell studies, I can tell you that that can be a long process. Once it's proven successful in cell studies, it then generally moves on to animal studies. And once there's success in animal studies, and generally speaking, animal studies take a while to just, cell studies are generally quicker just because of the life cycle of them, but also, these sorts of things take a long time. But once they prove to work in animal studies, the FDA has to review all of the collected information over the many years of discovery, cell, and animal trials in order to give permission for the drug to move to a clinical trial.
Okay, super interesting. So, I think that we often think of clinical trials as the last resource. Is that correct? Because I often, my mom is a survivor. I have many family members affected by cancer, and with all the patients that we serve, we often hear that they look for clinical trials as the last resource. Can you tell me if that's supposed to be that way?
Yeah, so I think that historically that is something that people think, and we've been kind of in the past, I think maybe that was the case, but now I don't necessarily think that is. Because there are so many treatments and those sorts of things in clinical trials that sometimes there might actually be something that we want to use, or that a physician might recommend somebody try a clinical trial drug, for example, prior to something that is on the market, because it's something that's been proven successful in some clinical trials already and with some patients. And oftentimes getting access, or clinical research gives people access to a treatment, before it's on the market and before it's readily available. And so sometimes it can actually be something that, a doctor or physician would recommend kind of trying to get involved with earlier, as opposed to it being a last resort. And the clinical trial, like I said previously, it's about a 10 to 15-year process for something to even come to clinical trials often. And then things can be in clinical trials for many years too. And so we might have a lot of good data about a drug while it's still in the clinical trial process, and know that it's still pretty effective. And it might be something that we want to use, not as a last resort. Phase one. So phase one is done to find if a new treatment is safe for people. Often phase one trials are done in a way that's called a dose escalation trial. And so this means that the first number of patients, whatever that is, sometimes it's 5 patients, will get a very low dose of the drug. Once those 5 patients have received that dose, they'll then do some sort of safety testing to ensure that that was safe, of course, monitoring those patients for any side effects, those sorts of things. If it was shown in those 5 patients that it was tolerated well, then, for example, for the next 5 patients, they might give a slightly higher dose. And sometimes this can happen in 3 dose escalation kind of steps, or, it sort of depends on the trial. But that's phase one. So they're looking at mostly the safety of the drug or intervention. A phase 2 trial starts to tell doctors a little bit more how well the treatment works. So after a phase 1, we're knowing that it's safe. The phase 2 trial, they'll generally look at the phase 1 to help show what dosage they should give to people in the phase 2 trial. And then they'll start looking at, okay, they'll still continue to monitor the safety. That's of course something that's monitored for the life of any trial. But then in phase 2, we'll start to look more at how well does the treatment work. And then in a phase 3 trial, the new treatment is starting to be compared with a standard treatment that's given to patients today. So one really big goal of clinical research is not only to find a treatment that works, but something that works better than what's currently on the market. It's not super useful to keep finding treatments that works just the same, as something on the market, or has all the same side effects or something like that. We really want to start comparing it to what we have on the market now. And one thing I will say too is in phase 1 and 2, generally there's not any placebo that we're comparing it with. Phase 3, there can be a placebo, but if there already is a drug on the market for a certain indication, it'll oftentimes be used as a comparison as opposed to a placebo. So it would be like the current drug and then the new drug that's being tested. After these 3 phases and the treatment, or if the treatment is determined to be safe and effective, that's when the FDA would then approve it. And it is sort of a longer process, to get approval. They have to submit all of the safety and efficacy data, showing dosage and those sorts of things. the FDA would approve it for clinical use. And then, even if a drug is FDA approved, it's still continually monitored for safety. So it's not like FDA approval means like, hey, we're not monitoring it anymore. It'll still continue to be approved. There's also phase 4 studies that sometimes look at treatments that have already been approved by the FDA. Before, but a potential benefit is, since this process, like I mentioned, is kind of long, potentially 10 to 15 years, if not more, participating in a trial can give patients access to the newest treatments earlier than they would normally be available, which is potentially a benefit. Oftentimes, treatments in clinical trials are kind of held to higher standards because, like I mentioned before, the ultimate goal is to make them better than our current treatment options. So if we have a treatment that's being tested for clinical trials and it looks like it has kind of the same effect as a current treatment and the same side effects, that's not going to be good enough. We want something that's better. So also, many patients do report that the experience of enrolling in a clinical trial is sort of similar to what they would have received without participating, but say that they did get better care and received closer attention from the trial team, because it's often, something that's investigational and a new drug. There's a lot of monitoring and those sorts of things to make sure that patients are feeling good, and, to make sure that if there are any issues and those sorts of things. Generally, the cost of treatment is covered by the study sponsor, and sometimes they can also provide additional compensation to participants. This can be if they have to travel or those sorts of things. It kind of depends on the trial. There are some trials that don't necessarily cover the cost of treatment. I think that's a little bit more rare, but that should be disclosed from the very beginning so that a patient knows that and can make those decisions, before enrolling. Help scientists learn more about what treatments work, and this could potentially help people in the future that have the same indication that the patients in the trial have. Possible risks. The new treatment may not work better than the standard treatment does for you, so it might not be as much of a success as you're hoping for. There could be side effects that either are expected, but also there might be side effects that aren't expected that come up in the duration of the trial. There could be side effects that are potentially worse than those of standard treatment. They often have information about expected side effects, but sometimes if there's been a smaller sample size up until that point of people who have tried the drug, they might not have as much information. You might be required to make more visits to the doctor than if you were receiving standard treatment. This really depends on the trial. I think with COVID and those sorts of things, people are trying to do a lot more telehealth and make that more accessible too, so patients don't always have to come into a clinic or a hospital, but sometimes there are more visits just for monitoring. And like I said kind of before, health insurance might not cover all patient care costs in a trial, but this should be discussed very early on so that you know which costs are covered and which are not, and you can make that decision before even enrolling in the trial.
Since at Feel Beautiful today, we target all this information for cancer patients and survivors. Can we explain to a cancer patient or a caregiver, when is it an option or a time, or how do they find information about these clinical trials? When is the time? How do they find the information? And what's the step to take in order to be part of one?
Yeah, great question. I don't think that there is a specific time that's the right time necessarily. I think the time could be when you're ready and when you're interested. That could be very, very early in diagnosis. That could be in the middle of treatment. That could be after treatment. For survivors, there are plenty of research or clinical trials for survivors that aren't actively receiving treatment. So I think that if it's something that a patient is interested in, that's the right time, even if it's maybe just a little bit of interest, if they're unsure, if they just want to start looking into it. And my recommendation would be, you can ask your physician. Sometimes they know about clinical trials, either that are going on at their specific institution or that are maybe going on at another institution that they know about. You can also, a lot of hospitals or hospital systems have kind of on their website information about what clinical trials are going on there. At Clara Health, we also have a team that can help if you're interested in a clinical trial that can help you find one for a certain indication. So you can always kind of chat with our patient operations team. And then I think a good thing to think about too, if it's something that you're interested in is, would I be interested in a trial that is interventional, that's a drug, or a surgical treatment, or would I be interested in something that's more observational? There's also sometimes that are about exercise or yoga or meditation. And so those are all options too. Art, these are all clinical trials that are going on, as long as, sometimes they're not in your area or something like that, but just kind of something to think about what kind of clinical trial you might be interested in. Yeah. So I think that our founders really saw that there was a missing piece in clinical research, that there wasn't a good way for patients to get connected to trials, and that sometimes patients were not necessarily the center of clinical trials. And what I mean by that is that there wasn't a lot of patient support necessarily. Trials, need patients to happen. You obviously can't have a clinical trial without patients, but they don't necessarily make it easy on patients. It can be really hard to find a clinical trial. For example, one of our founders her idea of Clara Health came to her when she saw a flyer somewhere that was advertising for a breast cancer, I believe, clinical trial. And she thought, this is not the best way. And so at Clara, we really care about our patients and making this a better experience for them. And I think that there are a lot of misconceptions about clinical research, but I think some of those come from real experiences that people have had in clinical trials of either, not feeling supported or not feeling like it was easy to find, or like it was, even once they were enrolled in it, that it was kind of difficult. And so at Clara, our goal is really to support patients in their clinical trial process from the moment they're thinking about wanting to join a clinical trial and helping them to find that, as well as the enrollment process and the whole life in the clinical trial and travel to the site and all those sorts of things. Because, being in a clinical trial shouldn't be unnecessarily complicated for a patient. It should be something that's made as easy as possible on them, and they should have as much support as we can provide. And at Clara Health, that's something that we're all really passionate about.